I was in my life in touch with top level performers. And since I stopped as well, I met many other athletes from other sports, I've been asked just about every football question you can imagine. People ask about Arsenal. They ask about the Invincibles. They ask about Thierry Henry, Patrick Vieira, Cesc Fabregas, and whether I would do anything differently if I could live my career one more time. Some people want to talk about tactics. Others want to know why I always believed young players deserved patience. I enjoy those conversations because football has given me a lifetime of memories. But every now and then someone asks something that makes me pause before I answer. Not because it's difficult, because it's personal. They'll say, Arsenal, which players did you admire the most? Admiration is different from simply saying someone was the greatest. Greatness can be measured with trophies, statistics, or records. Admiration comes from something much harder to explain. It's the feeling you have when you watch a player and suddenly realize you're looking at football in a completely different way. I've been lucky enough to spend more than 40 years around this game. I've watched players from every continent. I've coached against some of the finest talents in history. I've stood on the touchline trying to stop men who seemed impossible to stop. I've also spent countless evenings watching old matches, studying players from generations long before mine, trying to understand why they were so special. And the interesting thing is this: the players who stay with you aren't always the ones with the longest list of medals. Sometimes it's the player who changed the way everyone else thought football should be played. Sometimes it's the one who made the impossible look completely ordinary. Sometimes it's simply the player who made you smile every time the ball reached his feet. I've admired many footballers over the years. Far too many to mention in one conversation. But there are 5 names that always seem to find their way back into my thoughts. 5 players who each in their own way remind me why I fell in love with this game in the first place. And the first one, well, without him, football might look very different today. When people talk about Johan Cruyff, they usually begin with the trophies. 3 European Cups with Ajax, a Ballon d'Or, Barcelona, the Dutch national team. All of that is true. But honestly, that's never what came to my mind first. What fascinated me wasn't his art. It was the way he seemed to understand football before everyone else did. The first time I really studied him, I found myself watching the players around him almost as much as I watched Cruyff himself, because every movement he made seemed to pull somebody else into a different position. One step forward. Another player drifted wide. One quick turn. Suddenly there was space where there hadn't been any a second earlier. It looked simple. It wasn't. People often think intelligence in football comes from making the difficult pass. Cruyff taught us that intelligence begins long before the ball even arrives. He already knew what the picture would look like 2 or 3 seconds later. That's an extraordinary gift. As a young coach, I spent countless hours thinking about why certain teams always seem to have an extra player available. The answer wasn't numbers. It was movement. It was understanding space. Whether people realize it or not, so much of that thinking can be traced back to Johan Cruyff. Years later, when I arrived at Arsenal, I always wanted my teams to play with freedom. I never wanted players to feel trapped inside rigid positions. If a fullback could attack, let him attack. If a midfielder saw space, let him go. Football should breathe. That idea didn't belong to me. Men like Cruyff helped shape it long before I ever stood on the touchline in England. What I admired most was that he never played the game with fear. He trusted intelligence. He trusted technique. He trusted that if players understood each other well enough, football could become something beautiful instead of simply efficient. That's a difficult balance. Many coaches talk about attractive football. Very few actually believe they can win with it. Cruyff did. Somehow he convinced generations of coaches to believe it too. I don't think football today would look the same if Johan Cruyff had never played. Some players leave behind records, others leave behind ideas. Ideas last much longer. That's why Johan Cruyff will always have a place on my list. You know, my generation didn't grow up watching Pele every weekend. It wasn't like today where you can find almost any match with just a few clicks. Back then you had to search for old recordings. Sometimes it was a short highlight reel. Sometimes it was an old television broadcast that another coach had managed to save. Those tapes were passed around almost like precious books. Whenever Pele appeared on the screen, people stopped talking. Everyone simply watched. You weren't just looking at a great footballer. You were looking at someone who seemed capable of everything. He could finish with either foot. He could score with his head against much taller defenders. He could sprint past people. He could slow the game down when it needed calm. He could create chances for teammates as naturally as he scored them himself. Every part of his game felt complete. As coaches, we're trained to notice weaknesses. Every player has one. Maybe they rely too much on one foot. Maybe they struggle in the air. Maybe they don't enjoy defending. With Pele, it became surprisingly difficult to find those limitations. The more I watched him, the more I understood why so many people considered him the complete footballer. What I admired even more was the happiness he brought to the game. He never looked burdened by football. He looked grateful to be playing it. There was always a smile, always a sense of freedom. Even under enormous pressure, he played with imagination instead of fear. I think that's something we've slowly lost in modern football. Today, players are analyzed every minute. Every mistake is replayed. Every decision is criticized. Sometimes that pressure makes football look like work. Pele reminded the world that football should also be enjoyed. At Arsenal, I always encouraged creative players to express themselves. Of course, discipline is important. Without organization, talent quickly loses direction. But once players understand the structure, they should feel brave enough to create something unexpected. Pele understood that naturally. His skill was never about showing off. Every movement had a purpose. Every touch created a new possibility. He entertained people because he played with intelligence, not because he chased applause. Generations have passed since his greatest matches, yet young players still speak about him with enormous respect. That tells you everything. Some legends belong to one era. Pele belongs to football itself. For me, he became the standard that every complete player has been measured against ever since. Football has always been a game of organization. As coaches, we spend hours thinking about structure. We work on positioning. We prepare defensive shapes. We analyze passing lanes and pressing triggers. The goal is to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. Then every once in a while a player comes along who reminds you that football can never be completely controlled. For me, Diego Maradona was one of those players. You never truly knew what he was going to do next. I don't think his opponents knew. I don't think his teammates always knew. Perhaps even Diego himself didn't know until the moment arrived. That's what made him so extraordinary. Whenever the ball reached his feet, the entire stadium seemed to lean forward. People expected something, not because they knew what was coming, because they believed something unforgettable might happen. That's a very special feeling. I remember watching the 1986 World Cup. Many people immediately think about the hand of God. It's impossible to separate that moment from football history. But when I think about Diego, another image always comes to mind first. The goal against England, he collected the ball inside his own half. There were defenders everywhere. Every sensible option suggested he should pass. Instead, he kept running. One defender disappeared. Then another. Everything happened so quickly, yet it somehow felt completely under control. I've watched that goal many times over the years. Not because I wanted to admire the finish, because I wanted to understand the decisions. How could one player process so much information while moving at full speed? I eventually accepted that some things cannot be fully explained. Some players calculate. Maradona seemed to feel the game. He sensed where space would appear before anyone else recognized it. He understood defenders almost instinctively. The moment someone hesitated, he attacked. There was no doubt, no second thoughts. That confidence spread through an entire team. When Diego played, his teammates believed they could defeat anyone. As a manager, you understand how valuable belief really is. You can improve tactics. You can improve fitness. You can improve technique. But genuine belief is much harder to create. Some extraordinary players simply give it to everyone around them. Of course, Diego's life wasn't perfect. He faced struggles that have been discussed for many years. I'm not here to ignore those realities. I'm speaking about the footballer, the competitor who accepted responsibility when the pressure became unbearable, the man who wanted the ball even when everyone else hoped somebody else would take it. There have been many gifted players throughout football history. Very few possessed the natural genius that Diego Maradona carried every time he stepped onto the pitch. That's why he will always have my admiration. I've always believed that one of the rarest qualities in football is the ability to remain calm when everything around you is moving too fast. Most players react to pressure. The truly exceptional ones seem to slow time itself. That's exactly what I saw whenever I watched Zinedine Zidane. People usually begin by talking about his first touch, and rightly so. It was magnificent. The ball never seemed to bounce away from him. It stayed close almost as though it understood where he wanted it to go. But what impressed me even more was what happened before that first touch. He had already read the game. He had already seen the next pass. He had already decided where the space would appear. That's why everything looked effortless. It wasn't because football was easy for him. It was because his mind was always one step ahead. I followed Zidane throughout his career, from Bordeaux to Juventus, from the French national team to Real Madrid. No matter where he played, one thing never changed. He carried himself with remarkable composure. You could place him in a World Cup final. You could put him in a Champions League final. You could surround him with 90,000 supporters. His expression rarely changed. He never looked rushed. I often tell young coaches that panic spreads very quickly in football. So does calmness. When your best player stays relaxed, everyone else begins to believe they have more time. Zidane gave his teammates that feeling. I still think about the 1998 World Cup final. People remember the two headers. They remember France lifting the trophy. Of course they do. But I also remember how comfortable Zidane looked carrying such enormous expectations. Then there was Euro 2000, another tournament where his intelligence stood out every time he touched the ball. And later came that unforgettable volley in the 2002 Champions League final. It's remembered as one of the greatest goals ever scored. What made it even more remarkable was how natural he made it seem. Only the greatest players can do that. They perform something almost impossible, then walk away as though it were completely ordinary. That's Zidane. He never chased attention. The attention simply followed him. As a manager, you always hope to work with players who make intelligent decisions. Zidane made extraordinary decisions almost every time he played. That wasn't just technique. That was football intelligence of the very highest level. People often say football is an art. Most of the time it's simply a nice expression. With Zidane, it genuinely felt true. He didn't just help teams win, he reminded people why they fell in love with football in the first place. That's why he could only be this high on my list. People have often asked me what it's like to prepare a team to face Lionel Messi. I usually smile before I answer. Not because it's an easy question, because every manager who has stood on the opposite touchline understands the same reality. You can spend an entire week preparing. You can analyze every match. You can identify the spaces he prefers. You can tell your defenders exactly when to press and exactly when to stay patient. Then the whistle blows. A few minutes later, Messi does something that wasn't on any video you studied. That's when you realize you're facing someone truly unique. I had the privilege and sometimes the frustration of competing against Barcelona during one of the greatest periods in club football. We knew who the danger was. Every supporter inside the stadium knew. The players knew. The journalists knew. It still didn't make stopping him any easier. What always amazed me wasn't only his dribbling. Everyone talks about that. His balance, his acceleration, the way the ball seemed attached to his left foot, those qualities were extraordinary. But I admired something even more, his decision-making. Football is a game of choices. Every second presents another decision. Pass, dribble, shoot, wait, move. The greatest players make the correct choice more often than everyone else. Messi did it almost every single time. That's an astonishing level of consistency. I remember one night at the Camp Nou that has stayed with me ever since. It was 2010. He scored 4 goals against Arsenal. As a manager, evenings like that are painful. You work so hard preparing your players. You believe you found solutions. Then one extraordinary footballer quietly dismantles everything. Of course, I was disappointed. Nobody enjoys losing. But when the match was over, another feeling slowly replaced that disappointment. Gratitude. Because I had witnessed greatness from only a few meters away. Moments like that remind you why football continues to inspire people across generations. You don't measure Lionel Messi only by goals or assists or Ballon d'Or trophies. Those achievements are remarkable, but they still don't fully explain his impact. Children wanted to play football because of him. Coaches returned to the training ground trying to understand him. Even opposing supporters sometimes applauded him. That is incredibly rare. When I look back over everything football has given me, all the players I've watched, all the teams I've coached, and all the generations I've been fortunate enough to witness, one name naturally rises above the rest. Not because he made football look simple, but because he made perfection seem possible. For me, Lionel Messi is the footballer I have admired the most. As I grow older, I find myself thinking less about results and more about memories. Results belong to history books. Memories stay with people Football has changed enormously since I first fell in love with the game. Players are stronger. The pace is faster. Technology has transformed the way we train, recover, and analyze every match. Tactics continue to evolve year after year. Every generation believes it has discovered something completely new, and perhaps that's true. But the essence of football has never really changed. At its heart, this game has always belonged to extraordinary people capable of making millions of others feel something special. That's why admiration can never be measured by statistics alone. Goals matter. Trophies matter. Records deserve respect. But numbers rarely explain why a player remains in your mind decades later. The players I chose today each gave football something unique. Johan Cruyff taught us that intelligence could change the game before the ball was even touched. Pele reminded the world that greatness could still be joyful. Diego Maradona showed that one player could carry the hopes of an entire nation. Zinedine Zidane brought elegance to the biggest stages, making impossible moments appear beautifully simple. And Lionel Messi proved that even after more than a century of football history, perfection could still surprise us. Young coaches sometimes ask me which players they should study. My answer is always the same. Study every generation. Every era leaves behind lessons worth understanding. Football is a conversation that never truly ends. Each great player passes something to the next. I've simply been fortunate enough to spend my life listening. These 5 men didn't just win matches. They changed the way millions of people understood football. They certainly changed the way I understood it. And for that, I will always be grateful. Thank you for spending these moments with me. I hope these memories brought back a few of your own. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never lose your love for the beautiful game.